Hello, welcome back. Today I have a story for you. It is the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges is what people call a civil rights activist. She was very, very young, and Ruby fought for civil rights just by going to school. So today we're going to read and learn about Ruby Bridges. This story is the story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, and it's illustrated by George Ford. There are a lot of biographies out there about Ruby Bridges. This one just has some cool pictures and illustrations, and it's more child-friendly. This is Ruby. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. That's a state. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. Her dad worked to pick crops. He was a farmer. And they barely got by. There were times when they didn't have much to eat. Then they had to move away because her dad lost her job. At this time, Ruby is 4 years old. So she is the same age as some of you that are watching. In 1957, so a long time ago, the family moved to New Orleans, which is a different state. It's in Louisiana. Ruby's father became a janitor, and her mother took care of the children during the day. Every Sunday, they went to church. At that time in 1957, and for many years, Black children and white children went to separate schools, at least where they grew up in New Orleans. The Black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the law. So here they are in a courtroom. This is a judge, and he enforces the law. All these lawyers and the judge work together, and they told these 4 girls. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 Black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of them went to McDonough 19, which is a district, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in William Frantz Elementary School. So Ruby, at this time, this is years later, she is in 1st grade, so she is about 6 or 7 years old. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church and they prayed for Ruby. Do you see Ruby? There she is. Here's Ruby on her first day at the new school. She's here with some marshals. They are police officers, and they help her get inside the building safely. I want you to look at the crowd. A lot of them are white people. Let's read. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside of the school. They carried signs, and they said they didn't want Black children in the white school. People called her names. They scared Ruby. Some of the city and state police didn't want to help Ruby. So these are the federal marshals. They're a kind of police officer, and the President of the United States ordered them to help her into the school building. They made sure that she stayed safe. Every day, for weeks and months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the school surrounded by police officers. She wore a clean dress and a bow in her hair, and she carried her lunch to school. She walked slowly for a while. As she approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed towards her. The police officers kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and wouldn't say a word. There she is. Here's Ruby at school. Do you see any other kids? The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, or to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went to school with a big smile on her face, ready to learn. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught, says Mrs. Henry. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. Here's Ruby and her teacher. Sometimes I'd look at her and I'd wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those angry people and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she didn't want to go to school. Then, one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there, facing all those men and women and children, and she seemed to be mumbling to herself. She's talking. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what she could be saying. The crowd seemed really angry. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby said, "I wasn't talking. I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who didn't like her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the same prayer she repeated twice a day before and after school. That is the story of Ruby Bridges. I will tell you that years later, 2 white boys went to the school with Ruby. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. They all got their education. Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls went to school. By the time Ruby was in 2nd grade, the angry people, the mob, had given up their struggle. And the federal judges ordered that New Orleans schools be desegregated. So everybody of all races and skin colors can go to school in the same room. And that is the story of Ruby Bridges. Thank you for joining me today. Have a great weekend.